Welcome to Fisher Webinars. The following is a recording of Could Consumer Focus on Sustainability Disrupt the Tissue Business, originally recorded on Thursday, May 23rd, 2019.
Thank you, Kelly, and good day, everyone, and thank you for joining the webinar. It's my pleasure to maybe challenge people's thinking a bit about sustainability and what part of that might disrupt the tissue business or be a need to keep tissue makers up at night. First, I would like to, for people who aren't as familiar with Fisher International, introduce us just a bit. We're an information services management consulting firm offering information and consulting to the pulp and paper business worldwide. We believe that every company, especially those that are making decisions about very expensive assets, should have the best possible business intelligence as to how they should acquire and deploy and operate those assets. To do that, we offer both consulting and a Fisher Solve Next platform that allows people to keep up and investigate the background for their decisions. So we believe we have the best information available for strategic decision making. We do these deep dives like today in thought leadership and provide expert consulting to support businesses in making their decisions. With that, I'd like to jump into tissue sustainability, and I wanted to share this photo that talked about putting a roll of toilet paper superimposed with a tree stump. And this is from the the National Resources Defense Council, so it's oriented a bit toward North America, but saying that maybe Americans are flushing force down the toilet. That got me thinking about tissue sustainability and wondering what disruption means with regard to sustainability in tissue, and should tissue makers really care about something like this? So first, a definition. What is sustainability? I could have gone back to a very technical definition that many of you are probably thinking of a circular economy and tracking from the raw materials all the way to the use of the product to how it's disposed and recycled in our economy as a definition for sustainability. But I chose a broader one that was done by the Economist Intelligence Unit last year, talking about product quality, operational efficiency, all those things competing with concerns such as working conditions and environmental impact. So really want to make sure that the ethical norms, social structures, and natural resources affected by a company's operations are measured as part of how it affects future generations. So I think that has been shown recently to start having proven business advantages, and only recently are we seeing consumers paying more for sustainable products. As we go through then, what dimensions of the tissue business I thought we should talk about. First and foremost is the fiber supply and type, going back to the photo that I shared with you earlier. Water consumption and discharge of operating a tissue mill. Carbon emissions, of course, because that's becoming more and more a focus and challenge as we wonder what might be coming in terms of taxes or restrictions on emissions. And then finally, what it can be done in terms of product design or substitution. Should simply, if tissue is causing a problem, should we just use less of it? And what would be the potential? So when we talk about disruptive technologies and issues, I'm really going back to Clayton Christensen, Harvard Business School. You've probably heard about this business disruption and things so many times. So as we look at a subject that has as many off-ramps to side discussions as sustainability, I think it's important to have a focus on coming back to what things are really going to disrupt the tissue business and the technology used in the tissue business to stay focused. So want to start with some things in the news, and again, going back to the National Resources Defense Council, which is located in the United States, and they have an issue with tissue scorecard that you see on the left, excuse me, on the right in the slide, where they grade various tissues in the United States market as being A, B, D, or F. I guess none of them are average. And they have a graph that, or excuse me, a flow chart that shows how basically forests go from the trees to rolls of tissue to being flushed down the toilet. So obviously there's some really big concerns about tissue fiber out there. And I wanted to balance that with some quotes from news that I found looking at uh, just several companies, Sofidel, Essity, P&G, Georgia Pacific, Kimberly-Clark, all talking about either reducing plastics or sustainability goals. Recovery of paper into fiber, reducing greenhouse gases. So you can see that many of the tissue makers and all of the ones on this page are actually operating in the United States. So there's some response to this going on. Let's see what that really entails and what should we be thinking about it. Specifically on the fiber supply, I've grabbed some tissue fiber sustainability headlines, and we see some, again, other scorecards. I believe the one on the right this time is from Greenpeace. And we see more and more the focus in North America on should we be using more and more recycled toilet paper and should we be using less of it. And of course, this is at odds with, as the headline says, Americans tend to use the softest possible virgin tree fiber. And I guess that's becoming quite a debate, specifically regarding Canadian forests in Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, that, again, a quote from Vice Media, Americans are literally flushing Canada's forests down the toilet. So that's a focus that people seem to be concerned about. I wanted to take a look at maybe some more of the details using Fisher-Solve into what's happening with the actual use of fiber in tissue business. Some positive headlines. I wanted to make a note. UPM in Finland is not a tissue maker that I know, but I think as a paper maker, they have captured the industry response to what you saw well, in that saying that the amount of forests in Finland have grown between 1990 and 2017 significantly. At the same time, they've harvested a significant amount of wood, and this is in a response to good management. And of course, they're saying they're climate heroes because they're actually managing and growing forest sinks that absorb carbon in a sustainable way. Some questions from the North American side is, does really cutting down a forest eliminate the opportunity to see a forest and have one available, or does it preserve a forest and make it worthwhile to keep around for generations? So if we see some of the things coming, like wood or non-wood based paper can be equally sustainable. So 2 points of view, if you will, that I think are worth considering. I found one of the best resources to try to understand this on a global scale, going back to the WWF, or World Wildlife Fund, and they have something they call deforestation fronts, and they've been tracking these for years, and have identified specifically 11 of the world's most threatened forests. Almost all of them are tropical. And it does show a difference between the Greenpeace National Resources Defense Council and them. They are focused mostly in the tropical areas. They do not include Canada, and that is a difference that I think those of us here on North America, whether we're tissue users, producers, or environmental activists, ought to take a look and see if we could figure out a little more. But these are some very specific areas that I think have very strong concerns across many people in the world, and an opportunity to think about fiber sourcing from these areas and if that is really going to be considered sustainable. So a potential disruptor, if you will, if you're focused on fiber from one of these 11 areas. Going to the Fisher Solve Next product to try to understand what the world is actually using in fiber, we see that already across the globe, 26% of the fiber going into tissue production is recycled. About 2% soda, and so far the small amounts of non-wood fiber have not shown up. So questions that I'd ask is, does the WWF focus drive sustainable forestry certification? And do we need to measure that? And of course, I'm expecting, and we'll show some data on new non-wood sources coming in that are going to change this. And are we really focusing on the right things in North America? I'm not going to make a judgment on that, but ask a question that maybe we all need to step back and take a look at what the focus is with the tree stumps and the product being left behind. Looking again more deeply at the data, we do see in the regions of the world, this is how much furnish volume is consumed by tissue making, that North America is using about the most recycled furnish, and by far has the greatest percent of recycled furnish. So in some respects, we're doing a good job of sustainability in that respect. The question is that enough, and is that really addressing the concerns that these two environmental groups specifically have for North America versus the global concern? And I'm not sure we've answered that or can answer that here. One of the things that a colleague of mine, Stuart Sharp at Fisher International, has asked is there a new pulp game in town? Is a tree-free fiber, and that is a word I found sometimes send chills down tissue makers' backs, but does that have a place in the industry? Can we move forward? And so I've captured from the web just recently some examples of North American tree-free fiber, and as you see from the data, that is 100% bamboo and sugarcane, or what I would call bagasse fiber. And so is this going to find a place in tissue? And I'm going to suggest that maybe, but it's not a way to do it as what I'm going to suggest is potentially greenwashing a niche product with boutique fibers, that in order to be a sustainable, fibers have to be grown in a appropriate way without undue environmental harm, and then pulped the same way, not from wood or recycled fiber. Shouldn't be enough to just drive a sustainable, a continuing disruption through the industry. Again, one of the things we've noticed is that there's a new Phoenix process coming into North America, just like I think there's a renaissance in pulping non-wood fibers in China right now. And what we know, although it's confidential, is we believe it's non-pressurized, uses no sulfur, and meets all needed fiber properties for tissue in a better way than all the old-fashioned pulping of sugarcane, bamboo, and grasses that's been done for a long time. A comment then that both Stuart and I would support is, wheat straw that's either plowed under or burned in the fields, being, instead of doing that, but making tissue from that recovered fiber, probably is always going to be a good thing. So if that takes off, that is a potential source of disruption. So as I look through what we've seen in data about fiber, that tissue products permanently remove fiber from the recycle stream. We don't really recycle tissue. Corrugated boxes and paperboard used in consumer packaging can be recycled back in the same format over and over again with very high sustainability scores because the yields going back into the same product is very high compared to the relatively low yield experienced by the tissue recycling process. About 64% is the max I've seen. Cutting old or older growth forests in northern climates where things grow 40 to 80 years for a turnaround of a forest is always going to be seen as less sustainable. Back to that issue that's in North America compared to the US southern pine or the Brazilian eucalyptus. I think the southern pine is turning around 20 to 30 years. The Brazilian eucalyptus is 6 to 8 year turnaround. There is a risk from the monoclonal silviculture where everything on a Brazilian plantation is the exact twin of the tree next to it. And that might be a risk of climate change, but that's a different sort of potential disruption than being seen as sustainable. Destruction of the tropical rainforest that we saw in the chart from the World Wildlife Fund is to build a plantation. Cutting and burning the rainforest is always going to be a problem for sustainability with regard to biodiversity. And growing fiber as an annual crop on land used for food or land that's subpar for production is not going to be sustainable unless it's a byproduct of agriculture or some other thing. So I think the straw example that we saw was probably a good example of something that could be brought in from a point of sustainability. So I want to shift focus to water for a minute. That's another obvious part of tissue making because water is such a huge component of the process. And just taking a look in the news, we see on the left-hand side, again, some recent announcements from Kimberly-Clark takes action on clean water, Cascade Group, UPM, again, being recognized in China and talking about China giving an award for 11 companies that have really made a change in water efficiency worldwide. And at the same time, what our consumers are seeing is the world's facing a water crisis. So 1 billion people lack safe drinking water and sanitation. And in the US, we see the headlines that we're going to see a significant water risk developing, mostly in the western part of the United States with climate change. So it's reasonable to think that people are concerned about this issue, people that are consumers and make decisions and vote what type of tissue paper to buy. I want to go back to another one of my colleagues who recently did a webinar. Subhash, water, water everywhere, or his question is, or is it? And this is taken from Aqueduct Water Risk Atlas, but it was in his presentation. And what it gives you is an idea of there's very specific parts of the globe that have high water risk. And I think his conclusion helps guide us in this discussion that all water risk is local. There's a local availability of fresh water that can change as we see demand, growth of cities and population shifts, climate change, and therefore each site location is in a way its own world with regard to what its situation is and how people are probably going to view it in terms of water consumption. So I took, again, a look at the data, going to FisherSolve next, and the top graph shows the water volume for each of the countries in the world that is producing some tissue, showing how much tissue how much water they're using per day, and then what is the overall water risk shown on the bottom of the page in the graph. And we see a great deal of variability between both. Not surprisingly, Canada and the United States use the most water. But again, in many ways, they have the most fresh water. But these are just averages by country, and I don't think they really help us track what are the risks and sustainability factors that an individual mill should be looking at. So going to the next graph, what we've done is taken the same water volume um, and plotted it for every single tissue machine in the globe as a circle. The bubble size of the bubble is indicating what the size of production, the amount of tons per day that that mill is producing. And I've got two graphs. I realize the data tends to plot over itself, but I think that's the point. The first one is a case of looking at what is their fiber source, what they're running with, and we see that in general, virgin recycle mill sites tend to use the most water, and that's not surprising to me because, of course, those sites are the ones with a pulp mill probably built where they have a very significant source of water nearby. Um, However, looking down at the second graph, I was anticipating the question, do advanced technologies such as TAD um, use more water than conventional processes? And it's hard to look, but I think those blue circles that are hiding in there show it's pretty well distributed. So I would say no, they don't seem to have a correlation to using more water than other things. But stepping back from this just a bit, looking at, again, the sum of the overall water risk for each individual site as rated by Fisher, we see a very broad range of risks, but relatively little change with that risk in how much water they're actually drawing. So that's curious. It's something one of my colleagues, Matt Elhart, had noted. I had a tappy tissue meeting a couple of years ago. So why people are not adjusting the amount of water they use is curious. So let's take a look at carbon footprint. I think that's what many of you might have been thinking about for sustainability coming into this, and what is the future going to bring? Um, Carbon emissions are a serious consumer concern. Wasn't going to get into talking about what the evidence is either way. I put some of it on the page since I'm a member of the American Chemical Society. But this is what our consumers are hearing daily. Time is not on our side. And I think we need to think about what can be done about it and how that might affect tissue manufacture. So again, my colleague Subhash has done a paper on this and some observations and conclusions up front to kind of guide our thinking. Many paper mills have significant potential around the globe to improve their energy efficiency. Not maybe as much as the water that I was showing you, but overall, there seems to be a tremendous variability between what can be done and what people have done in their mills. Cogeneration, he commented, is a win-win from every angle, and reduction of greenhouse gases, because it's dealing with mostly energy efficient, is generally a good thing for the bottom line. Again, a concern I think that all of us have in places around the world, if you're interested in sustainability, is that we have a while to go of coal being used as an expectation, and he's indicated some of the areas where this is. And of course, biomass fuels could be burned in coal-fired boilers, so that is an opportunity to actually improve. But let's take a look at the Fisher data. What does that tell us? And the Fisher data allows a couple of ways of looking at things. And in the announcement for this webinar, you saw a chart drawn that shows by region what is the carbon emission per metric ton of tissue produced. And not surprisingly, just like water use and others, North America comes out on top of that dubious prize. But I've shown the graph two ways. Cradle to gate would show including the raw materials coming in, specifically at the bottom of these bars, the green showing the carbon content and emissions included with producing the fiber. Um, then we see looking at gate to gate, where we're only looking at what is actually gone into the tissue making process at the site. And we see America is still the highest rate. And the question I'm asking is, if a carbon tax or a governmental restriction on carbon emission is coming, is what is the tax going to be based on? And I'm thinking it's probably going to be the second case, taxed on the what's going on the manufacturing sites. That gives an idea what it would look like, but it would be a regional or national based tax. And the question that you have to ask, getting back to disruption, because this brings up so many side areas of investigation, is how is this going to separate or disrupt an individual mill on a cost basis versus what they're doing now? So what I did to take a look at it is I plotted just the North American tissue mills on one graph, and you'll see this raising, so it's really all three grades. The first section with a rather steep curve going up and then a drop off represents the away from home or commercial business. And we see that then follows by the retail or at-home business, consumer business, and then a tiny amount at the end follows, shows the industrial tissue business. What we have are the same two types of graphs as we had on the previous page. So you see the green bar on the first set showing the amount of carbon energy with the raw materials coming into the site. In most cases, that's the pulp, and having it removed in gate to gate, just looking at the specific site. And what we want to see there is, first of all, I was surprised that the commercial grade curve is very steep. And they're all generally dealing with recycled fiber, recovered fiber in North America. And my comment is also looking, there's significant variation between what is purchased electricity versus CO2 from fossil fuels. So each site has a rather unique fingerprint. And when things are this steep, depending on how the carbon tax or emissions could be placed, I think it could disrupt that cost curves, the curve of costs for those mills significantly by adding very different tax for each site. It wouldn't be the same at each site. So I think that is a potential source of disruption. The consumer type mills are not as steep, but I think still offer a pretty significant opportunity between the differences in purchased electricity versus fuel. So quite a change possible. I won't show you the curve, but I did go through and do the same analysis for Europe overall and found basically the same conclusions, big differences between each site, perhaps not quite as steep a slope of the curve or differences, but still significant enough that I'd expect any change with regard to carbon costs would disrupt that mill's competition, either helping or significantly hindering it with regard to the others in the market. I had done a paper recently on tissue through air drying process, and does it really use more energy? And just anticipating some of your questions, I'd say both electrical and thermal energy per ton are always increased by using through air drying. And then we get into a significant discussion of, does that lower basis weight or higher performance tissue, fewer grams of tissue fiber used per instance of consumer use make a difference? And that's been something that's been argued. We've seen that already in California between two tissue makers using different processes. both taking a position opposite the other of which is the best way to measure it. How that would turn out if that was turned into a carbon tax is difficult. It does mean that these alternatives that we see in structured tissue recently um, might make sense if we're thinking in terms of carbon taxes that might be added. So finally, I wanted to jump forward and take a look at the product design, something that maybe people are thinking of beyond the carbon tax when we go forward. And I'm going to ask a question. I don't want to make a value judgment, but are some of these designs for sustainability? Potentially, are they greenwashing? And what I found is two things in the market. I think the Charmin Forever has only been out there about a month. Scott, I believe, was something from last year. Toss the tube, and 17 billion toilet paper tubes are thrown away every year. And I think the question I want to ask is, are these a big deal? I do see something behind them. Uh, both practices could save transportation energy. Getting rid of that tube probably gets rid of some of the weight. But if you think that way, that Charmin Forever roll almost seems like they're positioning themselves in a world of e-commerce where it's coming via the delivery truck to your house. And certainly I would expect those rolls would be much more cost efficient and carbon efficient to ship. So maybe that's what they're thinking about here, just a thought. But at the same time, the North American concern about flushing forests, if you will, has brought a lot of comments and web articles about replacement substitutions. And my question to you is, would these products change your tissue consumption? Should they change your tissue consumption? The first thing, and this is brand new, I have to say, on the web, is the cloth toilet paper tutorial. And yes, I'm serious, is what it says, is out of people's comfort zone, but it's sort of like using cloth diapers, but we're using wiping with a reusable cloth that then is laundered and reused for sustainability. Maybe a less radical approach is a bidet, something that Americans do not see as often as Europeans. And to that end, you see a device there at the bottom of the page in the center. And what those are is a proposal for a carry with you all day water flushing system, personal water flushing system, to eliminate your need for toilet paper. I have to say I haven't seen many of those. Up on the top, on the right, we have the Kohler automated toilet. You're probably familiar with the fact in Asia that many of the upscale hotels, especially Japan, the expectation is they're providing an automated flushing, washing and drying toilet that does not require toilet paper. At least that's the claim. Here in Wisconsin, where we make an awful lot of bath tissue, Kohler actually makes these, so we're involved in that too, and I think people are getting them in high-end houses. Do show just a common dish towel as opposed to kitchen roll paper towels. And finally, this is a Dyson not hot air dryer, but very efficient hand dryer. And I'd say of all the things that are on this page, the one that I'm seeing potentially using or replacing tissue the most, especially in Europe and followed by North America, is this approach, as these have come more and more to be accepted in high-end offices and hotels. So are things out there that we see substantive change, or is it simply greenwashing? Some changes can have a real impact, and I wanted to give you that example. I apologize for the language here under this column I call greenwashing, but I at first thought that this was a sarcastic ad, not serious for toilet paper, but it does give an example. Yes, people are really doing this, And what they're trying to do is say that by playing on people's disgust or concern, it creates a brand. The photos below I just took recently in my home area. They're selling water in plastic bottles, and they seem to be charging about $2 extra a bottle, but then they're making a contribution to people in a water challenged village to help them get water. I'm not sure that addresses the concern I have as I use plastic bottles. More importantly, to those of us in the tissue business, is the note that's been slapped on the hand dryer, sustainability for a shared planet. The hand dryer, using this energy efficient hand dryer reduces paper towel consumption, and I'm not sure when it's powered partially by coal power, like I know this one is, that's a really good thing. However, I think substantive change is coming. And here's a photo I took last week at North American Provini's uh, headquarters and pilot plant, showing work and experiments that they're doing actually with some Latin American designers and paper companies. And they're saying we can replace the plastic wraps in tissue production and go back to tissue packaging and transport at every thing where there's a pack wrap and then there's a bundle wrap. And the question is, why couldn't we wrap the paper and protect it with paper out of something that would be recyclable, sustainable? And I think that's a interesting and challenging idea, and should expect we'd see more ideas like that coming soon. So some conclusions are, I think recycled versus virgin pulp is maybe the wrong question. It's more of what is a sustainable tissue fiber that can come from either certified sustainable forest, recovered fiber, or for non-wood sources. Can we find a way to certify the fiber that solves these problems and disagreements that I was showing? And is this a blockchain opportunity for making sure that it is sustainably managed and we know what we're getting? All water risk is local, as I've said, so it doesn't seem to be an area where it's going to affect anything but a mill that should know they're in a water stressed area. It does beg the question of why doesn't the cost of water wasted get more attention in paper mills? And maybe that's something we need to look into from an operational excellence standpoint. Any carbon tax or restriction can have a major disruptive impact on the individual mill cost within the market, the country, or the region. The question is how it's going to be calculated, but I think people need to be aware where their mill stands now with regard to their competition to be ready for that. Product greenwashing is common, but it's not just the manufacturers and the sellers, it's the facilities you're using, you're visiting, it's the interest groups. It seems like everyone has been guilty of this, and as consumers and government get more educated, will we get a more shift to the real issues? Plastic wrap replacement by paper seems to be a disruptor that could come quickly. One thing I'll share talking to the people who make paper converting equipment is that they think it wouldn't be as hard as it might sound to get the paper running through equipment that was designed for plastics. Most tissue ships by volume, not weight. That means every time you see a load of tissue being transported by water, by rail, by road, that there is a significant carbon cost in transporting it because of the inefficiency due to its large volume. It's puffed up, you're shipping a lot of air, and is there a way to continue to reduce that footprint and reduce the carbon footprint? And then, of course, I think it's what's next. And I want to suggest that this is an area that if you're a tissue producer, you need to know how your mills or products might be affected. So with that, thank you very much.